All right, Frank, let me start with you. This is not a headline that you expect to see. Israel and Hamas agreeing on any kind of deal, and yet this deal actually seems to be substantial. What's your insights?
Well, the first part of the deal is the most morally gratifying part because it brings at least to a temporary end and hopefully a permanent end this conflict, which has done so much damage, killed so many lives, has consumed so much public opinion, has spilled out in all sorts of ways that historians will look back on and marvel at. But then there's the future, that this deal sets up something. Trump's bluster has brought us to a point where we can start to think and consider what the future of Gaza, what the future of the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians are. And this is the hard part to come. It's one thing to end this conflict. It's an amazing thing to see the release of these hostages. I've spent so much time over the course of the last couple of years talking to the families of hostages and dead hostages, and it's just been so aching to listen to them and to look into their faces and see the hollowness of their faces and the way that the families of dead hostages I've always found to be kind of most compelling, because there's this sense that they might be able to resurrect the dead, that there was this lack of finality that they were experiencing, and now that chapter will be over. And the Gaza, you have so many millions of people who are living in rubble, and there is no hope for that rubble unless the next part of this plan is nailed. And so here we are. We're on the precipice of something huge and morally incredible, but all of it for the future depends on where this goes next.
Yeah, you know, Frank, you wrote you wrote the book on Joe Biden, one of the books on Joe Biden, that one of the most important books on his administration. You also wrote a piece on all the times Joe Biden tried to move Bibi Netanyahu. And it's so fascinating. I've been talking to both offline, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Both of them had about the same opinion of Benjamin Netanyahu and were extraordinarily frustrated with him. But it was Donald Trump that was able to push Netanyahu to peace. Talk about the difference. Talk about where Donald Trump succeeded. Joe Biden did not.
Well, there were different episodes in the war. So when Biden was in the White House, we hadn't gotten to the stage in the war where Hezbollah was defeated, where Donald Trump stepped in and bombed Iranian nuclear sites. And I think we can never forget about that part and disconnect that from this current episode and the narrative, because that gave him a kind of moral stature and an ability to kind of push Netanyahu that Biden didn't quite have. And then we get to this point in the war where Israel bombs Qatar, which I think is kind of the decisive turning point in the diplomacy, in the moment where Trump was forced to choose between two different allies, between one ally that he's kind of more financially enmeshed with himself, right. and that was the moment where he really began to push. And there's just so much bluster that I think was required in order to bring this thing to fruition. And credit to Donald Trump, that's the thing that he possesses in spades.
You know, it's so interesting. Some of the very things that, of course, many people find offensive about Donald Trump. He sort of has this strongman aura. He looks at himself as a strong man that is so offensive to us domestically, are some of the very things that, you know, we've had diplomats from the Middle East, leaders from the Middle East saying, yeah, we don't care about your checks and balances. This guy understands us. We understand him. We can do business with him, which is, again, nothing nice about it. I mean, but it's about, again, it's getting to a deal. This is just the reality of it. He was able to push Netanyahu for political reasons because he's more popular in Israel than Netanyahu. And he was able to deal with these Arab leaders because they understand him and he understands them.
And underscoring that relationship, let's remember his first foreign trip of this term, setting aside the brief jaunt to Rome for the Pope's funeral, was to the Middle East, to the Gulf states, skipping Israel. And that these are relations.
And by the way, you, David Ignatius, a lot of people said at the time that was a significant decision and sent a very clear message to Netanyahu. I'm not like every other president. I'm not coming and bowing to you. I'm going to go to other people in the region. It was, again, at that time, that was seen as a pretty important decision.
Yeah, there were a few key pressure points along the way. That was one of them, the most significant, as Frank just said, the aftermath of the attack in Doha, and then President Trump getting wind that Netanyahu had been telling his allies that, hey, the President of the United States will do what I tell him. So, Dave, certainly that's the foreign perspective, but obviously there's domestic politics here in the United States as well, how this issue, and we know how animating the situation in Gaza has been for so many Democrats. Tens of thousands of innocents, women and children killed, and we shouldn't lose sight of that today either. You've just written in recent days about how Democrats are using this issue against each other.
This development, I want to see how that changes things. Just 72 hours ago, though, you were seeing more Democrats get into primaries against incumbents, almost universally more critical of Israel. And in the most recent in Memphis, Steve Cohen, Jewish member of Congress, represented Memphis for 19 years, has a young African-American challenger who used to work for him, and that's one of their differences. He called what was happening in Gaza a genocide. Steve Cohen did not. And does this change things? I don't really think so, because we were just talking about Joe Biden. What is the foreign policy establishment in the Democratic Party? Who gets taken seriously? Who do they look to as somebody who can lead them out of a crisis? Kind of nobody right now. It's not like anyone in the party is saying I'm going to go to Antony Blinken for credibility and for I'm not trying to be blasé about it, but there is a collapse of faith inside the Democratic Party about any of their leaders having not just the ability to end a war, but to lead them through a foreign policy crisis. And in the meantime, on the left, really talk to anyone under 40 on the left, there is no support for Israel, and you are seeing this ricochet throughout the party. I don't know if this peace deal changes it, but certainly you hear this all the time talking to Democrats. Anybody who was not for a ceasefire, anybody who was for the Biden policy is going to have to answer for that, because Biden couldn't end the war and Trump did. That's a very simple way to put it that I've already heard in the last 12 hours.
Right, and Molly, this has been an issue that's been...
New York Times opinion contributing writer, Molly Jong-Fast.
There you go.
There we go. My mistake.
Well
Congratulations.
Wondering if we had breaking news, and in fact, yes, we had breaking news. So thank you for putting that in. It's so fascinating to me that there is a split in the Democratic Party on the issue of Israel. There always has been, not quite as dramatic as post October 7th, but there always has been. It's also very interesting, too, that Democrats, a lot of Democratic presidential candidates are like, I must do this or Trump will win the Jewish vote. Yeah. I must do this or Bush will win the... I'm like, dude, Democrats always get 70% of the Jewish vote.
Yeah.
72, 73, 70. Yeah. So there's this intramural fight. There is no doubt about it. But for the most part, when the elections come, the presidential elections come, the Democratic Party usually gets, whether it's Donald Trump or whether it's George W. Bush, they get 70, 75% of the vote.
Yeah, and I want to go back to what Dave just said, because I think it's really important. I think there's a schism, and I think it's people over the age of 50 who feel really that you can't criticize Israel.
Right.
And people under the age of 50 don't necessarily have that same kind of, I think, for someone like me who's Jewish, who grew up Jewish, whose family's been here for many generations, my feeling was you can criticize a political leader without criticizing the many important aspects of Israel.
Right.
And I think that is a little bit harder for the older generation because they're more connected to history. But I do think this is a real schism, and we've seen it in the party. And it has, and the idea, I actually think it's possible that a peace treaty will sort of deflate some of that.
Yeah.
And it may actually be, if they treat the Palestinians well, it may actually be.
Well, Frank, let me bring you into this. I've always said I'm pro-Israel, and I actually am critical of the Netanyahu government because I'm pro-Israel, and I hate to see support slipping. So that's me as a Southern Baptist. I'm curious about you as a Jewish American who lost so much of your family in the Holocaust. And we've talked about it. You've written about it movingly. Talk about that. Like looking at Israel and right now this split in the Democratic Party.
Well, I do think it's the split within the Democrats is going to deflate meaningfully. I don't think it's going to disappear because I think that to some extent the Palestinian cause has become part of the civic religion of the left. It's become, I think, the marker of ideological purity on the parts of the left. The question for me about how the Democrats move forward for here is there are different variations. I think that possibly Donald Trump, with this deal, has restored a lot of the fundamental tenets of the type of liberal Zionism that I cling to, which is that there is a possibility for peaceful coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis, and that if there really is a pathway towards Palestinian self-governance in some way, shape, or form in the distance, and keeping that dream alive and mainstreaming that, I think is, to me, the single most important thing for the long-term strategic interests of the state of Israel, for tamping down anti-Semitism in the United States, and for restoring some sort of consensus in American foreign policy about how we can take this desperate, horrible, awful thing and transform it in a direction where there's some optimism glimmering in the distance.
Yeah, but Dave, really quickly, just following up what Frank said, kind of goes to your article, and we all know politics. We all know what happens in primaries. As Frank said, it's sort of become sort of the civic religion, the Palestinian cause. So peace deal or no peace deal, there will always be people on the left that will try to outflank on the left, whoever the mainstream candidate is, by maybe embracing the Palestinian cause even more tightly.
Well, and there are factions. You've seen this in New York with Zahra Mamdani. He comes out with a statement October 7th, and he gets criticized from the further left, saying this is not going far enough. He acknowledges that Israel. I've seen Mamdani get protested by people who are annoyed that he said Israel should be able to exist as a secular state. They don't want to exist at all. So that's another possibility here, that these factions on the left that Frank was talking about splinter over what they want to happen, because there are the factions who want they have that map of the Middle East that has no Israel on it. There are the factions that want a two-state solution. They might be divided while the rest of the party moves on to other topics. That's possible, but it's about what's in the next steps of this deal.